Hello guys, welcome to the first in a hopefully very long series of flight simulator tutorials, but this first one being just the first circuit, just getting used to your aircraft, going back to basics. You know, a lot of people try and jump straight into airliners, which never works out. You're best off doing it the proper way, getting in a Cessna, and then how to fly the old-fashioned way, stick and rudder. The absolute perfect way to train as well is base it off real world procedures, and that's what we're going to be doing here. So first we'll start with a walk around, straight into it, check the flaps. Those hinges up at the top are a key area that you need to check, as well as the flap surface for any gaps or any corrosion, anything like that. Then on to the ailerons, same thing, hinges and corrosion, make sure it moves freely. Check the lights, make sure there's no cracks, make sure they're working properly. Come along the leading edge of the wing, make sure everything there's working, check the pitot and the static ports, make sure the tie downs are removed, check the wing strut for any signs of wear and tear. And once you're ready, also check the fuel level by just checking on top of the wing. And then coming around the engine bay, just checking that everything there works, even look at the wheels as well, make sure the brakes are all good, because you want to make sure the aircraft is airworthy. You don't want any surprises as you're flying. Then you come around the front of the aircraft, check the propeller, any signs of visual damage, contact with the ground, and you also just want to make sure that it looks generally right. You'll get a sense for it as you start flying. Check the exhaust area, the nose gear, make sure the oleo strut's not overly compressed, making sure that it all looks as it should. Next it's on to the top of the engine, check the oil quantity. You can't really do that in MFS, but you can have a look, see where it would be. Again, leading edge of the right hand wing, just checking for any cracks, anything that looks out of the ordinary, the lights, ailerons, flaps, everything that we did last time on the other wing. Another thing to note is on the wings you would do a fuel drain in the real aircraft. Sadly MFS doesn't model this very well, so we'll just have a look at the fuel drains and just make sure everything looks right. You don't want anything to be amiss when you're flying. Next you'll check the rear of the aircraft. Stabilisers or stabilators depending on the aircraft. We're in the Cessna 152, which has stabilisers and elevators. Check the rudder as well, make sure the antenna and the beacon light are looking as they should. Just making sure everything moves freely as well. And along the left side of the aircraft, just check that there's no signs of corrosion or any screws missing, anything like that. And one last check of the undercarriage, make sure everything's there, and jump straight into the cockpit. Right, so now we're on board. First thing we want to do is hide the yoke so we can see what we're doing. Power up the aircraft with the electrics, switch the batteries on. And you're going to want to bring the flaps up as well. We leave those down for the walk around, but you want to bring them up before you start the aircraft. It's always a good idea, just a good habit to get into. Make sure they're up on both sides. Next thing, make sure your nav light and your beacon light are switched on. You'll see everything I'm doing highlighted in the sim, with the exception of the primary flight controls. Next, the fuel cock goes on, make sure there's actually fuel going into the engine, and turn the transponder to standby or altitude, whichever seems best at the time. You'll come to get a grasp of this depending on the type of airport you're at. Next, we just make sure everything's working properly, so avionics come on. We'll also introduce a bit of throttle, crack the throttle, and introduce the fuel mixture, make sure there's fuel running into the engine. We'll prime it, introduce a bit of fuel into the system, which means it should start smoothly. Next thing you do is you check the fuel pressure, and you also check to see where the engine instruments are. Just make sure you familiarise yourself with that. You check your clear left, clear right, clear ahead and clear behind. You shout clear prop out the window, and you turn the key and it should fire right up. And there she goes. So as soon as it fires, you want to set up an idling RPM, which is usually 1200 RPM, usually for most trainers, but we'll just use 1200 RPM for this case. Turn the rest of the lights on, your taxi light, and you also need to turn your pitot heat on depending on the weather. It's quite humid here, a lot of moisture in the air, so you want to make sure that's on. Just checking the instruments, make sure everything's rising up to agreed levels. Also check the magnetos for a dead cut, to turn the key. And if the engine rumbles or anything, then you may have an issue, which we'll cover in a later video. It's quite an easy fix. You just want to check out, make sure that the flaps come down on both sides. I'll set the flaps to 10 degrees for takeoff. Just see me highlight where the flap handle is there. We'll bring the yoke back into view, just as we taxi out to the runway. Also, whilst we're at it, we'll set our altimeter setting so the altitude instruments display the correct altitude, and we'll set any radio frequencies we need, any nav aids or communication stations. At the same time, we'll verify that the audio selectors are all on in the correct manner, so COM1, COM2. We'll set our transponder to the correct squawk code. This will either be assigned by air traffic control or it will be a generalised squawk code. So as we taxi out to the runway, just keeping an eye on our surroundings. We don't want to get in anyone's way, especially at a bigger airport like we're at here, out in the Azores Islands. That's one of the joys of flight sim. You can fly at any airport, but it's a good idea if you know where you're training to get a few practice circuits done at that airfield. So now we'll face the aircraft into wind as we prepare for our run-up checks. We'll check that the engine instruments are all displaying in the green, make sure there's nothing that looks out of the ordinary. Once again, hide the yoke just for ease of access. Obviously real aircraft you can just have a glance over, just a limitation to the flight simulator. Check the fuel quantities, make sure they all agree, make sure there's no mismatches there. Make sure you've got sufficient fuel for the flight. Check that the oil pressure and your oil temperature are in the green as well as your fuel pressure. And what we're slowly going to do now is build up the revs on the engine to about 1,700 RPM, which is sufficient for the magneto check. So once it's stabilised, we'll check the left magneto, turn the key left once, and just check that the RPM drop isn't too high. It will drop a little bit, that's to be expected, but it shouldn't drop too much. Same with the right, just 2 clicks to the left and then back to normal, back to both. Whilst you're doing this, it's also worth checking the carb heat and the ammeter, so we'll do that now. Flick the landing light on, and you can see the ammeter there just on the right hand side of the panel. As you flick the landing light on, it should jump a little bit. Obviously within an agreed amount, it shouldn't go off the scale completely. Then bring the throttle back to a hard idle, make sure the engine doesn't cut out as you do this, and then bring it back to idle speed of 1,200 RPM. Point at this to make sure that the takeoff trim is set, so trim should be about neutral in most trainers, or it should be at the takeoff position as indicated. Now we're lining up, we'll turn the landing lights on as well as the strobe lights and do our final instrument checks just before we line up. Now just as we pull away, we also want to make sure that our right hand side is clear as we're making a right turn. Just make sure there's no aircraft that have gone behind us whilst we were doing the run up. And that's another thing you should look out for. Make sure you're not going to, sandblast any kind of expensive vehicles or aircraft behind you. It's always a very bad idea. But yeah, just enter the runway, make sure it's clear both sides as you enter. And yeah, now we're at the other end, we'll spin the aircraft round and we'll get ready for our takeoff. Again, just checking the approach is clear. And just using as much runway as you can. As well, a good point to note there, you will get in the habit of this as you progress with training. You will move the throttle, the yoke to the aft position as you taxi, especially if you're at a grass airfield. Just helps protect the nose gear, as you don't want any unnecessary stress on the aircraft. That's not something you'd ever want. Just verifying the flaps are in the correct position before takeoff. One last check of the instruments and we're good to go. So, off the brakes. Let the aircraft just sit as you add the power and release. Checking now that the instruments rise as correctly as they should, so RPM doesn't spike and it doesn't lag behind anything. Your oil pressure remains in the green zone. And also checking now as we're accelerating that the airspeed indicator comes alive. And now just passing 60 knots, aircraft will start to get light and we're airborne. Pitch for about 65 knots in the Cessna 152. It varies aircraft to aircraft, but that will give you your best angle of climb, which as per my flight school will fly that up to about 300 feet as soon as we're clear of obstacles. Passing 300 feet or an agreed safe altitude with your instructor, you'll put the flaps up, and this just cleans the wing up and reduces any drag on the aircraft, allows it to climb a little bit easier. Now accelerating to anywhere between 70 to 80 knots is a good climb speed. Obviously there is agreed statistics in the pilot operations handbook that will say exact speeds, but for now we'll just use between 70 and 80 knots. Turning onto the crosswind leg, you'll see I just looked under the wing, made sure there was no one in our way, and at about 600, 500 feet we'll commence that turn. No steeper than 20 degrees, 15 degrees if you can. Just onto 90 degrees from the heading you're on, usually to the left, but it depends what information you're given by air traffic control, because your circuits can be playing with the left hand side or right hand side. Again, just coming through 1,000 feet, just making sure that the engine's running properly, T's and P's are in fact still green, and we're now lowering the nose and setting our altitude for the approach. We're now going to swing it onto the downwind leg, so we're going to make a left hand turn any second. Just watching the airspeed build as well. Now we've levelled out and pulling power a little bit to make sure we don't overspeed the aircraft. Anywhere between 80 to 100 knots on downwind is normal, depending on your aircraft type. Now 1,100 feet, you want to try and keep, especially when you're getting to the later stages of your PPL, you want to try and stay within 150 feet of your assigned altitude. The requirement is 300, but I always make sure I try and at least get it to 150. Obviously, weather conditions may not allow this. So now we're on the downwind leg, and we're just approaching the point where we turn onto the base leg. This is the last turn we make before we turn on to final approach, so this is where we want to start configuring the aircraft for landing. So if we make the turn, we reduce power to make sure that the aircraft isn't trying to accelerate away as we turn. We also want to think about starting to descend. This will obviously come as we level out of the turn. But as I say, this is where a lot of the action starts to happen, preparing for landing. So you want to make a quick look under the left wing, just make sure there's no obstacles or anything or other aircraft that are in the circuit. And then as you turn to about 90 degrees from runway heading, we'll just start to level out. You'll see there as we've decelerated into the white arc on the airspeed indicator, we've dropped 2 stages of flaps, so that's about 20 degrees in the Cessna 152. And that just helps slow us down, gives us a bit of extra drag, allows us to descend without overstressing the aircraft. On approach, anywhere between 55 to about 70 knots is acceptable, but aim for 65, as that's the best glide speed of the aircraft and it's where the wing is working most efficiently at low speeds. Also worth noting that on your approach you should aim to control your pitch with power and your speed with pitch, if that makes sense. So if your airspeed's increasing, don't add throttle, lower the nose, and if you find yourself getting too low, then you'll add power. So it's just something to be aware of, that it does seem a bit backwards at first and it doesn't make much sense, but it will come as second nature as you progress. Now we're established on final approach, we're on runway heading, we're on almost a glide slope. We're quite high here, but that's no issue for a light aircraft. As long as you've got the runway made, you'll come to get a better sense of judgment as your training progresses, especially real world as well. You'll learn how to slip an aircraft to lose speed, all that sort of complicated stuff that will come in later videos. You also saw I put an extra stage of flap in, which is the drag flap, which gives us plenty of air resistance, slows the aircraft down. And now we're just checking, we're making sure the aircraft is still on glide path, still on speed, and just bringing it all the way down into the flare. Now flaring is one of the hardest parts of the landing, so you'll see here, we get to about the point where we're over the numbers on the runway, we'll chop the power all the way back to idle, and we'll just try and hold the aircraft off the runway for as long as possible. So you'll see there, that was quite a late flare. So the aircraft landed quite flat, and that's just something that happens with landings. It does get hard to judge sometimes, especially as runways vary in size and shape. But now, touch and go, we'll bring the flaps up 2 stages to 10 degrees, which gives us a bit of extra lift, but not much drag. Full power, and just hold the back pressure in until the aircraft comes off the ground like it did before, just like a normal takeoff. Again, pitching for that 65 knot target speed. As always, it's not an exact number, you'll never fly it exactly, especially with wind gusts. Especially like here, we're quite near the sea, so we'll get quite a lot of gusts, so it's worth noting that it's quite hard sometimes. So here I'm going to demonstrate a soft field landing. This is just something you do if you're on a grass runway, so say a lot of the videos will be out of Manchester Barton, which is a local airfield that you fly from if you're from this area. But as I say, it's just a different take on a landing, one where all the approach is the same, it's just the last moment where you'd raise the nose and flare the aircraft, that you'd hold the aircraft off as long as possible, just to protect the landing gear from a rough surface. So over the numbers, power comes back to idle. You see the airspeed bleeds off like crazy, we hold the nose, hold it, hold it, hold it, hold it proud, hold it high, and there, perfectly plonks down onto the runway. We hold the nose up until the airspeed completely bleeds off and apply the brakes. Now we bring the flaps to 10 degrees, we could do another touch and go here, but again, as I say, it's pilot preference, you don't have to constantly do touch and goes, you can do full stops, low approaches, just whatever you need to do to make sure your landings get better. But the good thing with a touch and go is it practices both takeoff and landing in a single manoeuvre. But yeah, that was it. That's how you fly a circuit in a Cessna 152. In just about 15 minutes of learning, you will have got that nailed. And as I say, it's practice makes perfect, so just keep doing that again and again, and it can really help when it comes to starting your actual PPL. So yeah, thanks for watching the video. Stay tuned for more tutorials. We'll be going through the full training phase from basic, straight level flight, all the way up until you're ready to fly the big jets. So thanks for watching, stay tuned, and I'll see you in the sky. Bye guys.